Well, first of all, let me thank the National Institutes of Health, not just for setting up this room for us today, but for funding us for 10 years. Duke had a Center of Excellence grant for 5 years under Robert Cook Dagan at the Genome Institute, renewed for 5 years, and it took us 8 years to write this book, so it couldn't have been done without this funding. And secondly, let me remind you that Paul and I are not microbiologists, but our third co-author, Tom Dieter Verderer, is a director of the Biodiversity Governance Unit at Catholic University of Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium. He is a scientist as well as a law professor, a member of the Belgian Academy of Sciences, and he has been advising major microbial culture collections in Europe for years and years. The short title that we've given you is Why the Nagoya Protocol Matters to the U.S. The longer title would be A Multilateral Pathway to Facilitate Access to Genetic Resources for Research and Applications under the Nagoya Protocol. Either way, you can see that the Nagoya Protocol poses issues that we have to discuss. Part one of our book is entitled let's see if I can get this, International Regulation of Genetic Resources and the Assault on Scientific Research. The central theme is that basic scientific research infrastructure has been caught in a tug of war over intellectual property rights between developed and developing countries. How science policy can navigate its way through these contending forces and still preserve its basic infrastructure intact is the central focus of the book. Part two is thus entitled Preserving the Public Research Functions of Microbial Genetic Resources After the Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Well, I think in this audience it's not necessary to dwell on the historical importance and dependence of both scientific research and industrial applications on access to two major networks of ex situ genetic resources discovered in different parts of the world over centuries. The one I'm going to talk about, particularly focus on, is the public microbial culture collections under the aegis of the World Federation of Culture Collections. These are the 600 most important repositories of validated microbes that, for research purposes that are subject to standard quality control. And when it's taken from the World Federation of Culture Collections network, these, with one exception, these are all public goods. They're distributed at the marginal cost of distribution. The other network of great importance for our work is the network of public seed banks and repositories in which plant cultivars and seeds from all over the world were deposited for agriculture research and applications. This is extremely important for breeding new crops, sustaining old crops over the world. The seed banks are managed by the Consultative Group on Agricultural Research, and they are housed under the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, which itself is housed under the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And the director of that entity is here and will be talking to us later. There is a third and important component of scientific infrastructure at the WHO. That's the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response Systems, now the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. I'll talk about it a little later. The international legal question that first arose in the 1990s was, who owns these ex situ and in situ genetic resources that have historically functioned as global public goods? Well, before the 1960s, that was easy to answer, right? The provider countries were all colonized by the big powers, and the big powers said, this is ours, it's all in the public domain. And that's the way things stood until these developing countries were emancipated in the 60s. And in 1969, we got the very famous United Nations Declaration of Sovereignty over Natural Resources, which was signed by every single country in the world, including us. The seed banks and microbial networks are fundamental scientific infrastructure, and they came under attack at the end of the 20th century. Now, why? Well, the developed countries had already obtained sui generis rights in novel and stable varieties, plant varieties, as early as 1961, but the maturity of these rights occurred in 1991 when they acquired patent-like sui generis stability, and then in 1994 the TRIPS agreement made the protection of plant breeders' rights universal across 180 countries, more than 180 countries that belong to the World Trade Organization. Actually, the TRIPS agreement mandates sui generis protection in Article 27, and it also, the TRIPS agreement mandates that microbes be patentable subject matter everywhere under the World Trade Organization, in all 188, all but the 32 poorest, least developed countries. Everybody else has to protect them. Meanwhile, as this storm of pressure of intellectual property rights was gathering at the foundation of the World Trade Organization, the TRIPS agreement, the developing countries struck back by obtaining an enactment of the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992. And this convention, of course, proclaims and establishes sovereign rights of all countries in genetic resources originating from their territories. The convention, the CBD, further mandated that all users of these genetic resources, that's plant, microbial, and animal genetic resources, not human, had to obtain prior informed consent. Let's see, here we go. Prior informed consent, mutually agreed terms, and especially access and benefiting agreements, access and benefit sharing agreements with the provider countries. Let's call this the bilateral approach. If you want any of these genetic resources from a developing country under the CBD as it stood in 1992, you had to go there, you had to negotiate an agreement with them, which is very costly and burdensome. As a result, all unauthorized uses of genetic resources, even for research purposes, were deemed guilty of misappropriation, now international law of misappropriation, with theoretically damages to be paid to the originating country. There was no provision for scientific research in the CBD of 1992. So all uses, even of ex situ genetic resources in the microbial culture collections, and even the seed banks of the CGIR were open to question about illegal ownership and use. Meanwhile, access to in situ resources, of course, will always require going there and negotiate. So we had a crisis in the global scientific infrastructure for genetic resources, just when biotechnology was became the most promising areas to develop new products for food security, public health, and other areas from genetic resources. The CGIR's network of seed banks at the FAO were on the verge of collapse, and the activities of the World Federation of Culture Collections came under intense pressure as they struggled to come up with some kind of standard material transfer agreement that might satisfy the CBD. I think the most climactic moment occurred in 2005. Many of you will remember we had the outbreak of the H5N1 avian influenza subtype, and Indonesia refused to contribute the viruses to the WHO. Why? Because the last time they did that, they came back in the form of vaccines that were patented vaccines that were priced beyond the reach of Indonesians, and they said that's not going to happen again. So we had a major crisis. But already in 2001, the FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, had moved to rescue the CGIR seed banks by proposing a bold multilateral agreement to recognize their ex situ plant cultivars as a globally protected infrastructure. This infrastructure facilitated access to the participating seed banks for the purpose of both public and private research. And this was the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources of 2001, which unfortunately we still don't belong to, I think the only country in the world. Under this pioneering agreement, qualified ex situ seed banks were once again treated as providers of global public goods. available under international law without any additional requirement of informed consent or access and benefit sharing, because the benefit sharing arrangements are built into the treaty. Anyone can take plant cultivars from the treaty, use them for research applications, but they sign a material transfer agreement. They have to pay back a tithe from their commercial sales back into the international treaty, and the Director General of the treaty is here today. I call this the Crop Commons. Its formal name is International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources. It has, in effect, a liability rule, a take and pay rule. Anybody can take, but you have to pay later on if you put it to commercial use. The big question on the table after this pioneering agreement, international treaty agreement of the FAO was it legal? There's nothing in the CBD of 1992 that talks about a multilateral approach. The only pathway in the CBD is bilateral, negotiate with the provider countries. And of course, another question is, what about the microbes under the culture collections? They had to ask the same question. Now, the answer came in 2010, when the Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity was finally negotiated and signed in Japan, and it will take full effect in 2016. Now, let me say, from one perspective, there's a lot of bad news in the Nagoya Protocol, but for us, scientists, scientific concerned people, there's some very good news. What's the bad news? Well, the Nagoya Protocol strengthens the claims by provider countries to own all genetic resources and related data originating from their territory. The protocol specifically requires member states to make the protection of genetic resources and data under the CBD justiciable in their national courts and administrative procedures. And I say, well, where did they get that bold idea? Well, we taught it to them. Under the TRIPS agreement, if a foreign patent comes into the United States, port arrives at the port, and the American patentee says that violates my patent, that's it, it's stopped. You have to go to a special court and you have to prove that you're not violating this American patent. Otherwise, it'll be seized as contraband. That's what the TRIPS agreement did. So they said, well, that's a good idea. By the same token, United States goods that violate the CBD, say because they are based on or derived from plants or microbes taken from a developing country without prior informed consent, mutually agreed terms, and access and benefit sharing, they will be blocked at the port of entry and seized as contraband goods. That is why the CBD affects the United States industry and scientific research, even though we haven't ratified the CBD. The only country in the world, I think, that hasn't ratified the CBD. We've signed it. Nevertheless, the exports will all be subject to the CBD under the Nagoya Protocol at every other port in the world. I predict that the CBD will become customary international law, with or without us. Now, the good news is that the Nagoya Protocol did something wonderful for scientific research. It expressly recognized the importance of scientific research as a non-monetary benefit to developing countries. It says it explicitly in the Nagoya Protocol. On this premise, Article 4 of the Nagoya Protocol expressly validated the multilateral regime of facilitated access to plant genetic resources available from the Crop Commons, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources. And to my relief, it did not do this in narrow, specific terms. It actually recognizes in all the provisions taken together that other multilateral regimes can be set up and don't even have to be under a treaty. They can be under a multilateral agreement. So this was wonderful. We knew that the Crop Commons, which has become a major frontline defense for food security under climate change conditions, we know that it's legal and it's dispatching thousands of cultivars every year for food security. By the same token, the World Health Organization promptly responded to the challenges and promise of the Nagoya Protocol. In 2011, it established the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, which collocates the collaborating laboratories that deal with pandemic influenza viruses, again in a multilateral framework that should meet the requirements of the Nagoya Protocol. And at least last time I looked, Indonesia was cooperating. The question we ask in the book is, how will the global network of public microbial culture collections respond to the challenges and opportunities of the Nagoya Protocol? This network is really important global infrastructure. Consider that in 1992, a blue ribbon panel at the National Academy of Sciences published the new research paradigm for the life sciences, calling it the new biology paradigm. And we were, our book was greatly inspired by this paradigm. The paradigm predicts, posits that all the life sciences should be unified, the barrier should be broken down between them, it should operate as a unified field, and that microbiology was to play a critical role in this unified field. Our book, as I say, was inspired by this paradigm, and what we focused on are the legal, institutional, and social obstacles, barriers to implementing the new biology paradigm, obstacles that the panel couldn't consider because they weren't lawyers. From that perspective, the tendency until recently has been for the global networks of the World Federation of Culture Collections to bury their heads in the sand. We have, for example, a recent European Commission directive dealing with microbial culture collections. And it assumes that they can continue to operate as under the status of trusted intermediaries using material transfer agreements that shift the risk of the Nagoya Protocol to the users. I know outside of the Commission, I know of no reputable legal scholar who agrees with that view. Instead, we believe that the WFCC must reconstitute itself as a specialized international access and benefit sharing arrangement. That is the specific language of Article 4 of the Nagoya Protocol. Now, if they do that, the protocol says it would not apply to the specialized instrument in respect of the specific genetic resources covered by and for the purpose of the specialized instrument. But without some kind of multilateral agreement, it's not going to work. From a legal perspective, in other words, the microbial research infrastructure must organize itself and operate as a formally recognized multilateral entity, as we explain in parts 1 and 2 of our book, and then again at the end on governance. Whether or not this requires an international treaty is open to question. I personally don't think so. I think just an international agreement would work under Article 4, reading it carefully. But you have to have some suitable foundation in international law. Without that, the public microbial culture collections cannot comply with the CBD, and that really threatens scientific research and industrial application. In part 2 of the book, we explain both the importance of the work that the microbial culture collections perform on behalf of basic and industrial microbiology, and we lay out a plan for embedding this infrastructure in an appropriate international legal foundation. At the same time, if the Nagoya Protocol poses a serious legal challenge, as I say, it also affords the microbiological community a unique opportunity. First is get your act together and come up with an international infrastructure. But once you do that, that is an opportunity to go beyond just a collection of microbial, a unity of microbial culture collections and build a true knowledge commons in which materials, data, and literature could be widely and openly shared under a single governing body. Let me point out that the Crop Commons is already on its way to becoming a fully developed knowledge commons. As you'll hear today, they've moved into their digital component, and it's going to be remarkable. So we think that all the elements exist for transforming the World Federation of Culture Collections into a true microbial research commons that could play a major role in implementing the new biology paradigm itself. How to think about doing that within a valid international legal platform is the burden of parts 3 and 4 of our book. Paul is going to speak now about the data component and what we've thought about data, and then I'll come back and say a little bit about the governance structure. Thank you.